November 12th, 1966. Clendenin, West Virginia. Deep within our hearts and souls as humans, we often find fear in what we truly don't understand. Shadows moving in the darkness, strange bumps in the night. Fear is what keeps us up at night, and sometimes fear we can't often explain. In the late 1960s, a legend born from fear was made, solidifying itself within the walls of the mysterious and the monstrous. The story of the Mothman is one of international headlines. Rumors of a harbinger of death, sightings that transcend countries and state lines, and possible connections with other strange figures make this legend take on a life of its own. Numerous books, TV appearances, and even movies have caused the legend to become real and take on a life of its own in the eyes of the public. But what many people often forgot about these legends is that to many people, these legends were real. The fear was real. The glowing red eyes, the whoosh of flapping wings, and the seeming trail of disasters being left in their wake. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, the first chapter into this multiple-part special investigation into a cryptid legend. A legend and story that has fascinated and gripped the attention of the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the United States, and the world for the better part of 5 decades. This is our first episode into our special investigation, The Mothman, Episode 1, Origins. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you were joining with me, I want to say thank you. Thank you for checking out this show. Thank you for checking out my content. I greatly appreciate it. While you're here, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out greatly, whether you're listening to this on Spotify or YouTube. And while you're at it, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at the same handle, Unblurring the Unknown, as well. I first want to say thank you for tuning into the very first episode of my Mothman series. And I'm very, very excited for this. This is something and a topic that arguably I've accumulated information for pretty much ever since this show's conception. And while I've known about the legend of Mothman basically since I was a very young teenager, I am no stranger to this story and the overall legend of Mothman and the cultural impact the legend and folklore of this flying beast has had on the residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and even the United States and pop culture in general. However, what I was unaware of is how widespread this legend has sort of become, and how many moving pieces it now has, and how many other similar creatures have been sighted all over the world, before major disasters, and in numerous countries in Europe and Asia. And even perhaps the connection that the Mothman case has with another unidentified humanoid encounter that took place before the bulk of the Mothman sightings that has often been grouped in with this legend because of its strange nature and time period. Now, because of all of this that I just listed, I have decided to do something that I believe I have never done before, and that is do a multiple-part series over multiple weeks covering different areas of this Mothman story, legend, and phenomenon, and all of the moving pieces this story has in general. I have found that more and more information I have found about the Mothman as the years have gone by, I felt more and more compelled that possibly all of these cases could be connected in some strange roundabout way, that I have never seen anyone categorize these types of cases before or kind of lump them together. As I was doing my research and kind of accumulating all this information, nobody had lumped these together, or, like I said, categorized Mothman or flying humanoids, under kind of this large overarching umbrella, and rather cover them as separate cases. However, in my personal opinion, when you look at the whole story kind of all of these stories of flying humanoids that all bear a striking resemblance to that of the original Mothman that we all know. When you take a look at all of these sightings, these cases and reports, it is impossible to not look and think that maybe there's something bigger that's going on here. And I've never seen anybody categorize all of the available Mothman information out there under one giant story. And that is what I've set out to do over this multiple part series that I'm going to be presenting for you over the next couple weeks. And with this entire story, like I said, all these sightings, all these cases and reports, it makes me lean towards the idea that people, whether you're a skeptic or a believer, they are seeing something. Whether or not it is the Mothman, that could be up to you. However, all of these factors combined, like I just said, helped spur the inspiration for these collections of episodes that I'm going to give you over the next few weeks. Each one with their own bookmark on the Mothman legend, and all of them equally deserving of their own episode. So what better way to cover this collection than giving everything their own episodes? Now, for those of you who might be totally alien to this topic, no pun intended, as to what Mothman is, let me give you a little insight real quick. Mothman is widely regarded as some type of cryptid or alien creature that was sighted in and around the area of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the Ohio River Valley over a 13-month span from November of 1966 to December of 1967. And the sightings would then abruptly end after a catastrophic tragedy would hit the town of Point Pleasant. But of course, we will get into what that was in today's episode. Now, today on the first episode, we are going to cover the origins of the Mothman legend, the first sightings around Point Pleasant, the subsequent investigations done by author, UFO researcher, and journalist John Keel, and a local journalist in Point Pleasant, Mary Heyer, as well as some of the other phenomenon that was recorded by Keel and Heyer during their investigations. However, one piece of the story I am going to be specifically omitting because he is getting his own episode in the next episode, or part 2 of this series, and I'm not going to tell you what it is quite yet because I want you to be surprised about where I take this story and where we go on each episode. And like I said, I want to kind of put together the most comprehensive knowledge and group of knowledge on all things Mothman that I can possibly find. So that one little tidbit of information I will be omitting from the overall story, but I will be diving into that next week. But with that out of the way, and you can kind of have a little background on what the Mothman is, let's dive into the episode today. Nestled along the banks of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, Point Pleasant, West Virginia is a small, idyllic place to maybe visit or raise a family. Steeped in history dating back to the 1770s and the American Revolutionary War, Point Pleasant stands as an intersection of American military history, industrial advancements along the Ohio River, in a small town that encompasses that small rural American town feel. And with it being in Appalachia, it certainly has that feeling. However, the town's crowning achievement would be the Silver Bridge, a technological marvel during the time of its construction in 1928. It stretches across the Ohio River and connects Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with its neighbor in Ohio, the town of Gallipolis. Now, for many, many years, this is what Point Pleasant was known for. However, in 1966, a dark cloud would settle over Point Pleasant and the surrounding area for the next 13 months. A string of strange sightings, experiences, and a plethora of other strange and cryptic activity would take place, leaving many wondering if their small town was suddenly home to a much different type of visitor. On November 15th, 1966, along the outskirts of Point Pleasant lies the old remnants of a much different time. The TNT area, as it was aptly referred to by the locals of Point Pleasant, was a collection of old military bunkers and buildings used back during war times as storage and production of explosives, most commonly, of course, being TNT. This facility would produce thousands of pounds of TNT during its tenure of being open, until it was eventually shuttered its doors when the need for constant explosives died off after World War II. The TNT area, as it was affectionately known, would shift into becoming the local town hangout for teenagers and young lovebirds trying to hide and sneak away for the night away from their parents, and we can all relate to that to a certain degree. Whether it is a park, sand pit, or back road, I think every small town in America has that one spot that kids and young adults flock to try to get up to some questionable behavior and maybe start a little trouble. However, many people who lived in Point Pleasant would often talk about and observe the strangeness of the TNT area. Animals behaved strangely, and plants and vegetation grew in weird patterns, mostly because of the ecological scars left behind from the manufacturing of the TNT. Now, they did not know it at the time, but the production of TNT causes borderline irreversible damage on the environment just because of the sheer amount of manufacturing waste that is caused through its production. But overall, while the TNT area was a place many used as a way to escape for an evening, the strange cloud and ominous nature of this area left many people uneasy, and this was well before anyone saw any type of monster. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallett were two young couples living around Point Pleasant between the ages of 19 and 20 years old. They frequently double dated, and one night were riding around the TNT area, and this would be November 15th, and they were, like I said, they were joyriding around. They were approaching the Old North power plant when a strange creature would emerge in the darkness. Described as 7 feet tall, with gray fur, muscular, enormous red eyes, 2 inches long and 6 inches apart on its face, it would unfold these massive wings it had nestled on its back. It would stretch them wide out with a wingspan of roughly 10 feet. Now, of course, when these young couples would see this creature, they would be absolutely frozen with fear. Roger would try to speed away in their car, and they would observe this creature try to awkwardly waddle towards them. Its movement very unnatural, almost like walking was not its most comfortable thing to do. Roger would eventually put their car in gear and drive away from this creature. This creature had then risen up and taken flight and taken off seemingly vertically like a helicopter would and started following the car. It would follow the Scarberrys and Mallets as they raced down the streets away from the TNT area, their speedometer going from 60, 70, 80, 90, and even 100 miles an hour, with the creature seemingly still being able to keep in stride, or should I say in flight, with the racing car, all while casting a dark shadow that the couples could see through the rear window. The creature would scrape and scratch the roof of their car until the couples would reach the city lines of Point Pleasant, and then the creature would disappear above into the night and into the darkness. At this point, like any normal person, or I would think normal person, the couples would then drive straight to the Mason County Sheriff's Office and recount this entire story to Deputy Millard Halstead. The couples, terrified with fear and clearly in a state of disbelief and panic. Halstead stated later that he had known these young kids their whole lives and had no reason to believe that what they were saying was a lie or made up for any reason. Rather yet, Halstead took their account at face value and believed them. Deputy Halstead would accompany the young couples back to the TNT area that night, but unfortunately they would not find anything. Now, it was this report that the Scarberrys and the Mallets had in this encounter that would catapult the story of Mothman into the front page of the local paper, and it was this that caused a domino effect to fall on the entire region. However, this would not chronologically be the very first sighting of the Mothman. The first sighting is conflicted, but allegedly seems to have taken place in the early 1960s when a woman driving near Route 2 near the Chief Cornstalk hunting grounds with her father, and they would sight or observe what they would describe as a large, man-shaped creature walk out onto the roadway. She would slow her car down as to not hit the creature, and this creature would seemingly spread out two very large wings from out behind its back and take off into the sky. Now, originally the witness did not report this, believing that no one would believe her story, and rightfully so. Now, not to sidetrack here a little bit, but I have spoken about this on other episodes, but the UFO thing and even people saying that they had run-ins with monsters and everything like that was not a widely talked about topic, and was not believed like you could say maybe it is today. People were very regularly ridiculed for this kind of thing, so I would imagine there would be some hesitancy to take a story and sighting like hers and go public with it. However, other reports would follow. In the summer of 1966, a doctor's wife in the same rough area as the first witness near the Chief Cornstalk hunting grounds would state that she had seen a 6-foot-tall man-like creature that resembled a giant butterfly. Then on November 12, 1966, the widely reported, depending on where you checked, first verified sighting of the Mothman would be seen by a group of gravediggers in Clendenin, West Virginia. Kenneth Duncan, one of the gravediggers, said they watched the creature for almost a minute as it was perched up in a nearby set of trees before it flew out of the trees and lifted off vertically. It was described as being brown in color. Then on the 14th, Newell Partridge would be at his home at roughly 10:30 p.m. that night, and as he got settled in to watch some TV, Newell's TV at home would start to go on the fritz and make all sorts of strange, metallic screeching noises and become all static. Newell's dog, Bandit, would be outside on the front porch, and as this would be going on with Newell's TV, Bandit would slowly become more and more agitated and begin to bark and howl like something was outside. Unsure of what was causing the issue with both his TV and what was upsetting Bandit, Newell would grab his flashlight and observe that Bandit was agitated by something off towards his barn. Newell would see a set of glowing red lights hovering near his barn that he would describe as looking like and being the size of bicycle reflectors. Bandit would eventually take off towards these glowing red lights, and while Newell debated chasing after his dog with his shotgun in hand, he didn't. Describing himself as almost frozen in fear, he could not bring himself to chase after Bandit in the red glowing lights. However, Bandit would not come back home to the Partridge house that night. The following morning, Newell would go outside of his home and search his property and would find Bandit's paw prints left in the mud in the barn in a circle, almost like he was chasing his own tail, and his tracks stopped right there. Now, this would also be roughly where Newell would say he saw the glowing red lights at, and Bandit had seemingly vanished out of thin air. Coupled with this, the Scarberrys and the Mallets stated that during their encounter, they would see the remains of a large dog alongside the road, and when Deputy Halstead and the couples would return to the area to investigate after their encounter, the dog was gone. Now, it is reasonable to assume that perhaps this dog that the Scarberrys and the Mallets saw could have been the remains of Bandit. However, there is no way to know that for certain. Now, while this first group of sightings took place before the Scarberrys and the Mallets had their sighting on November 15th, to my understanding, these sightings that took place before the Scarberry and the Mallets encounter did not fully come out of the woodwork until the Scarberrys and the Mallets had come forward with their sighting and it got published in the local paper. Now, the local paper was adorned with the front page headlined of, and I quote, "Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something." Now, like I said, this would start a domino effect and a chain reaction on the people of Point Pleasant, and people started to come forward with their stories like I listed above, and other people would start having their own sightings after the Scarberrys and the Mallets, and pretty soon the town was being overrun with these sightings of this flying, winged humanoid monster. Marcella Bennett would be one of the witnesses to come forward and claim to have had an encounter with what she would describe as a 7-foot-tall, gray, massive, and muscular creature with glowing red eyes that would step out from the shadows when she arrived home one day. She would be exiting her car with her baby in hand when encountering the Mothman, and she would drop her baby out of pure fear. She would then frantically manage to pick her baby back up off the ground and flee into the home and lock the door, only for the creature to follow up the front steps and skulk outside of the home. When sheriffs would arrive, they would find deep scratch marks in the wood outside of the home, in the walls, and after this whole ordeal, Bennett would end up being hospitalized due to severe anxiety from this encounter. For months afterwards, she would claim to hear noises and even screams coming from outside of her home. Then on November 25th, 1966, at 7:15 a.m., Tom Urey, a shoe salesman, would be driving along Route 62 near the TNT area when he would have his own sighting. He spotted what he would describe as a large gray figure with large wings, and it would take flight vertically into the air and pursue his vehicle, keeping pace with him as he traveled well over 70 miles an hour to try and get away from the creature. Then, 2 days later, on November 27th, 1966, at 10:30 a.m., Connie Carpenter would be driving home from church that morning when she was passing the deserted Mason County golf course on Route 62, when she would observe what she would describe as a large gray man with a 10-foot-long wingspan take off straight into the air and take off after her car. Described by Connie as being 7 feet tall, gray, and with red glowing eyes. Connie would describe that she felt like she was being pulled into this creature's eyes, and almost with a hypnotic effect the longer she looked at the creature. Almost like she could not look away no matter how hard she tried. The creature would hover above her car and would swoop low and follow her car until eventually disappearing. Connie would develop burning and swelling of her eyes for 2 weeks after the incident. Connie, turns out, would be the niece of Mary Hyre, a local journalist for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, like we covered just a few minutes ago. And she would, of course, become a focal point in this entire Mothman story, along with a man by the name of John Keel, who we have also briefly mentioned. John Keel is an author, journalist, and UFO researcher, and has spent large chunks of his life chasing down stories when it comes to UFOs and the unexplained. John Keel would also become the author of the book titled The Mothman Prophecies, a book detailing his account and research into the sightings and reports coming out of Point Pleasant. That book would become more famous over time, as in 2002, a movie was produced with the same name, starring Richard Gere. Now, John Keel would get wind of these strange sightings of this flying humanoid monster in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and want to investigate for himself. However, what he did not anticipate was that this was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to strange occurrences in the town and surrounding area of Point Pleasant. As John Keel investigated, by December of 1966, 30 encounters had been described and reported, all being remarkably consistent. Movement of the creature being described as odd and clunky when on the ground, but very smooth in the air, and screaming and screeching out during times of panic. Reports would come in from all over the Ohio River Valley, and sightings would come from across the river in Ohio and to even in the south in Salem, West Virginia. However, people weren't just having experiences with the Mothman. Reports started to come in about other strange phenomenon, strange lights in the sky, electronic anomalies in people's homes, and even sightings of mysterious strange men coming into town, dressed in all black suits. During John Keel's time in Point Pleasant, Mary Hyre would become Keel's primary source of information and help him pursue leads. Her office in the Mason County Courthouse would act as a base of operations for her and Keel's research in and around Point Pleasant. However, Mary would start receiving strange phone calls shortly after publishing the Mothman story, and mechanical voices on the other end of the line would ask her about UFO activity and her stories. And when she would try to trace the call about who was calling her and who this strange voice on the phone would be, the phone numbers would come back to be disconnected. In addition, men in black suits would show up to her personally and ask her questions about UFO activity in the area, and would display odd behavior, and they would seem extremely interested in silencing accounts of witnesses and what they saw. Mary would be scared, however, that would not deter her in her research and arguably make her work harder and even dedicate herself more to try to uncover what was truly going on. So again, keep in mind, now at this point, the story has grown into something a lot more unexplainable at the drop of a hat. Not only do we have Mothman sightings that keep coming as we start to transition into 1967, but we also have reports of UFOs and strange lights in the sky, as they were regularly seen around the TNT area during this time. We also had strange electric anomalies, like Newell Partridge's TV, for example. You also had people saying they got strange phone calls where you could only hear, these strange metal electronic noises on the other end of the line. And then you also had the Men in Black show up. Now, if you are unaware with who the Men in Black are, I'm not talking about the movie starring Will Smith. I'm talking about the actual Men in Black. I actually did an episode a little while back on a collection of UFO sightings and reports from 1947, most notably into the Maury Island incident and Kenneth Arnold. Now, Harold Dahl, back in 1947, the prime witness of the Maury Island incident, he would have claimed to have witnessed a UFO crash, and he would be visited by the Men in Black. And from this seems to be when I would be able to find the first recorded instance throughout my research and everything I've done up to this point, where the Men in Black seemingly appear out of the woodwork. And while their goals in the grand scheme of things are unknown, the MIBs, what are presumed to be top secret people working within the government, seem to have a lot of interest in extraterrestrial and UFO activity and try to silence or belittle witnesses, silence stories, and cover up information. So with all the reports of flying monsters and strange lights in the sky, it is no surprise that the Men in Black are suddenly making their presence known in Point Pleasant. Now, it would be only 3 weeks into Keel's investigation into what was going on in Point Pleasant when Mary would describe her sightings of the Men in Black to John Keel. These strange men spoke in monotone voices and didn't blink much, and acted very strange and stiff, and probed questions about the investigation to Mary over the phone and in person at her office. However, the Men in Black did not just stop at Mary Hyre, they also went after Connie Carpenter, who had a sighting of Mothman that she would speak to John Keel about. The Men in Black would pursue Connie Carpenter and would actually try to grab her arm and force her into their car, and Connie would be able to get away from the Men in Black, and she would frantically get home, scared for her life because she does not know who these people are and, what their motives could be, and thinking that maybe whoever this was, maybe they would stop when she got home, but she would be wrong. It would not stop. The Men in Black would supposedly then throw a menacing note under her front door saying, and I quote, "Be careful, girl, I can get you yet." Which A, is bad English, and B, kinda terrifying. John Keel, who of course would go on to write a book about this whole experience and do his investigations around Point Pleasant, which I, first off, have not read, but definitely want to at some point, started looking at patterns of what was going on in Point Pleasant. He was convinced that Mothman didn't just appear out of thin air like it seemed, and wanted to go back as far as he could into when the first sightings happened, and have a rough timeline of when the strange activity would start. Of course, the first sightings we would have would be presumably by the woman near the Chief Cornstalk hunting grounds earlier in the 1960s, which is unconfirmed, as I found only one source that mentioned that, but you would also have a sighting made by a pilot in 1966. On October 18th, so keep in mind that is before all of these, the bulk of sightings that happened kind of in the beginning of November of 1966, you would have a pilot state that they would see a massive bird-like creature while flying near Huntington, West Virginia. Now, shortly after that, on November 1st, 1966, multiple UFO sightings near Parkersburg, West Virginia, would be seen as well. However, those kind of wouldn't be put together at the time. However, when you go back and you start to chronicle this strange information, you kind of get a little bit of a pattern about this activity slowly escalating and slowly ramping up. As after the November 1st Parkersburg UFO sightings, you would have the sightings by the grave robbers in Clendenin, West Virginia on November 12th. You would, of course, have Newell Partridge's sighting on November 14th. And then on November 15th, you would have the sighting and the encounter by the Scarberries and the Mallets. So you really have a gradual increase of sightings from October to November, and then coming to a climax that winter of 1966 and into the springtime, with a majority of the strange activity coming near the TNT area and within a small radius outside of it. Keel interviewed everyone he could find who had a story and a sighting, and he would start to put together a more understanding of the pattern of behavior. The Mothman seemed attracted to young people, preferably couples, and people describe persistent nightmares post-encounter and strange electric phenomenon in their homes, strange phone calls like I mentioned, and unexplained scratching noises on the roofs of their homes. John Keel would further theorize that all of the activity was connected to each other, and that these were not coincidences or one-off sightings, and that these were all feeding off of each other and all of this activity was tied together. And he thought that the UFO activity and sightings were related with the sightings of Mothman. However, it was kind of tough to prove it without concrete evidence. However, Keel and Hyre would have their own sighting of a strange light in the sky, and Keel would actually attempt to communicate with it through Morse code via flashlight, and it seemed to communicate back to him. As Keel would flash his light in Morse code the word descend, the strange light would slowly start descending from the sky in almost a leaf falling type of motion, so kind of like a slow rock back and forth. This would, of course, freak out Mary Hyre, and I don't blame her. Now, Keel would, of course, chronicle all of this information, document all of this information that he would possibly gather, the sightings, the reports, the UFO activity, the phenomenon, the Mothman sightings, and by the end of this, and through all of the information that John Keel had gathered. And by the time he was finished, and by this point we've gotten well into 1967, John Keel had gathered, reported, and documented 127 UFO sightings, 47 Mothman encounters, 23 electronic interferences, 18 reports of Men in Black visits, and 9 accounts of prophetic visions had by the witnesses of these events. Now, while John Keel would slowly continue his research, he ultimately could feel like all of this activity was going to reach a precipice, and he could not shake that feeling, although he wasn't certain of what it was. The idea of something terrible happening in Point Pleasant would be shared by Mary Hyre as well, when on November 19th, 1967, Hyre would have a prophetic nightmare and see Christmas presents floating in the water. Now, she wasn't entirely sure what this was, or if this was even some type of prophetic nightmare at the time. However, it kind of was very ominous and foreboding and stuck with Mary. John Keel would become more of a believer into the thought of something terribly wrong happening in Point Pleasant, and would even write to Mary in a note and state, and I quote, "Mary, I have good reasons for suspecting that may soon be a disaster in the Point Pleasant area, which will not seem to be related to the UFO mystery. A plant along the river may either blow up or burn down. Possibly the Navy installation in Point Pleasant will be the center of such a disaster. A lot of people may be hurt. If this should happen, notify me as soon as you can and write the story normally. Don't even hint to anybody anything about this." Then, on December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge, which we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, of course, a lifeline for many living in this area and connecting many residents of West Virginia and Ohio to each other and their jobs, would become the site of a major accident. The bridge that connects Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, would suddenly collapse. At the time, it was filled with rush hour traffic, and a malfunctioning red light at one end of the bridge would cause the bridge to load up with traffic, and one of the I-bar support beams, number 330, would break. As it turns out, this number 330 I-bar would have a hairline fracture, basically caused by over a decade of weight and wear and tear. Seemingly on the surface, nothing could have been done to prevent the accident. The hairline fracture was basically invisible to the naked eye until it eventually grew larger and larger, and it would snap, starting a chain reaction that would collapse the whole Silver Bridge. Over 50 cars would plunge into the icy water of the Ohio River below, and when the wreckage was surveyed and rescue teams dispatched, 46 people would die in the collapse, and it remains the worst bridge collapse in U.S. history. Images would circulate of cars half sunk in the water below, twisted hunks of steel, and even Christmas presents floating in the water in the river, just like the nightmare that Mary Hyre had. She saw it happen and knew it was going to happen, but had no idea it was going to be the bridge, and there was no way to explain how this nightmare would seemingly become reality. Now, while the bridge collapse was mechanical in its fault, many attributed the strange happenings and sightings of the Mothman to the bridge collapse. However, shortly after the accident of the Silver Bridge collapse, witnesses would come forward and state they saw a shadowy and large figure flying above the Ohio River. It did not take long for many to try to put two and two together and blame the accident on Mothman, and perhaps that the creature was there as an omen, a sign that something wrong was going to happen. Now, while there is no way to prove that, it is fully cemented in the lore of this area that the Mothman could have been involved in the Silver Bridge collapse. After the collapse of the Silver Bridge, this seems to be where the story would end. The collapse signaled the major climax of this whole series, events like John Keel and Mary Hyre almost foresaw coming. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Mothman, as I see it. Many people have proposed theories as to what had happened over those 13 months in West Virginia, and while I am chomping at the bit to talk about those theories, I want to save all of the personal theories I have until the very end of this series so you can see all of my thoughts and theories on this entire case at the very end. However, John Keel, who of course witnessed and documented all of this, has a very interesting theory about all of this that I wanted to share with you all. John Keel thinks that Point Pleasant was some type of slip into a different plane of existence, and that these interdimensional phenomena and creatures and beings were able to slip through, and he thought this just because of sheer numbers of strange incidents, sightings, and activity that was being reported. And to be honest with you, I don't hate this, actually. Now, a lot of the times I say that I'm a skeptic, but when in lack of another, I would say, mundane theory is there, I actually kind of like this theory. There are numerous places all over the world that have been theorized to be gateways to other dimensions or planes of existence, and that all of this unexplainable activity is more concentrated in those areas, like the Bridgewater and Bennington Triangles and Skinwalker Ranch, for example. Now again, I will save all of these theories until the very end of the series, but while the events of Point Pleasant have seemingly come to a close for the meantime, it is just the tip of the iceberg. And on the next episode of this series, we will dive into an event that will take place before the bulk of the Mothman sightings in West Virginia and cover a sighting and an individual who has become synonymous with this legend, and whether or not this mysterious figure could be tied to and related to the Mothman phenomenon that took place in West Virginia from 1966 to 1977, and this figure's name would be Indrid Cold. On the next installment of this special investigation into the Mothman, we'll be diving into Episode 2, The Man Named Cold. Thank you for checking out this first entry into my special investigation series over the Mothman. This will do it for Episode 1, Origins. I hope you very much appreciated it, and I am very much looking forward to seeing you all back here for Episode 2. Thank you very much for all your support, and I will see you all on the next one.